Just a heads up, this episode is the first in a two-part series about the children of God. It contains discussions of child sexual abuse, so please listen with discretion.
My name is Christina Babin, and I am a survivor of the infamous cult called the Children of God, aka the Family International. I have been free now for over 20 years. I grew up overseas in Asia mostly and a lot of islands and being trafficked around, but I'm here now. So here to talk about it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in isolated authoritarian groups, also called cults, and how they adjusted to the rest of the world after they left their groups. I'm Deanna Levy, your host, and today we're going to be speaking with Christina, who was raised in an organization called the Children of God. This is the group that started back in the late 1960s by a man named David Berg and became infamous for its former members' later accusations of exploitation and sexual abuse, particularly by the children who grew up in it. Unfortunately, Christina was one of those children, and I am so grateful that she's willing to share her story with me today. Christina, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Deanna. It's good to talk to you, and I'm excited to have this conversation with a fellow ex-cultie. It's amazing the things we will have in common.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like mine wasn't as extreme as yours, but I do feel like the methods of control, there were similar methods of control, definitely less publicized, but I do feel like we have some things in common. So
it's like if every cult was a pizza, there's a different flavor for each one. some are double stuffed and some are just, thin crust, but
yeah,
it's still a pizza.
Yeah, mine has pineapple on it for some horrible reason. I don't know why.
Mine has barbecue sauce, and that's just wrong.
Yeah, no.
Oh, hey, you got to laugh or cry, right?
Absolutely. So, as someone who pays attention to cults, Children of God has come up a lot. Like, you hear about it a lot as an organization that's really exploited its members' sexuality and is known for being particularly heinous with its treatment of children. However, others who aren't as into cults or don't study cults might not be as familiar with this group. So I was hoping we could touch on the group's history before, we jumped into your story. So could you give me some background about the Children of God?
Yes. It's funny. I think one of the reasons that you don't hear about it very much is because it kind of leaves a yucky taste in your mouth. And it's one of the ones we'd like to put our heads in the sand for. But there's actually a lot of information and a lot of coverage over the years about this cult. It's just not really fun. But it kind of started like most other cults that started in the 1960s with a charismatic leader who was what I call Christian adjacent. He used a lot of Christian terminology and Bible verses, and he was a failed minister, and he had just been kicked out of his church for, rumor has it, sexual misconduct. But David Berg was very dissatisfied with the quote unquote religious system of his day. And he was looking for his niche in life. And he was in his late 50s. And he was in Huntington Beach, and he noticed all of the young hippie kids just kind of wandering around. A lot of them were homeless or on drugs. And I think he saw an opportunity, and he kind of went for it and started a ministry with his kids, and he used his family, and they passed out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and they kind of had a little twist on the Christianity, which a lot of cults and groups will do. They'll find something that's very familiar. Let's say it's yoga or it's mindfulness or self-help or Christianity or Buddhism, something that is very vanilla and we're all familiar with. And then they kind of tweak it and they just, we have a new version of this, a better version.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just familiar enough that people are comfortable with it, but it's new and exciting enough for them to feel like they're doing something different. And so that's what he did when he started the cult.
And how did he start bringing in members?
So they used, like I said, the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and music. So they had just playing guitars and tambourines and singing. And he had his own children who were teenagers at the time, and they were all playing music. And they started out having little like Bible study meetings where they would, do campfires and sing. And people started coming and hanging out. And it really seemed like a nice thing. It seemed like a beautiful thing. It was clean. It was pure. There was no drugs allowed in their meetings. There was, no boyfriends or girlfriends, nothing that the kids had been experiencing out on the outside. And they bought buses and they started traveling around in the buses. And then he started talking about the apocalypse. And that kind of got kids a little excited because you sort of need a common enemy to like pull them away from society.
Mm-hmm.
And so he started talking about the apocalypse and that the church was bad and evil. Their parents were lying to them and the end of the world was coming. So there was this, this need for, we got to hurry up. We got to get serious. We got to run. We got to get on the road. We got to pass out the message. And the kids were just young enough and naive enough to believe this.
At what point did flirty fishing become a part of the group's practices? And what is it?
Well, flirty fishing was one of the more radical types of outreach and fundraising that was done in the cult. So let me start off, back up a little bit. The cult was kind of fundamentalist Christian when it came to sex and romantic relationships. It was very puritanical, no holding hands, no kissing. Marriages were arranged and only for the glory of God. So what we didn't know was that Father David or David Berg, that he had, his own views on sexuality. And he himself was molested as a child. And he kind of came out of life and into this cult dynamic with some very unhealthy attitudes towards sex. And he slowly started incorporating those in. But, nobody ever joins a sex cult. Nobody joins a cult. They join a self-help group. They join a religious organization. But the water kind of gets turned up to a slow boil before you know it. So it was around 1974, not long after my mom had joined with me and my older brother, that the founder had told everybody they needed to leave the US. And once he got everybody overseas, then he started this new doctrine. It was called the Law of Love. And the doctrine goes, anything that is done in love is not a sin. So he came out with that doctrine first. And then his follow-up to it was, now we're going to show love to outsiders by having sex with them. And he called the women God's whores, harlots for Christ, love slaves. And he said that this was the most beautiful way to sacrifice oneself for God, is to go out and have sex with men on the outside world, or women, some of the men did it as well, to bring them to Jesus and also to support the church and support our communes. So as you can imagine, it wasn't very well received, and a lot of the women were horrified and unhappy. But you were already in a different country. You were already waiting for the end of the world to happen. There was this pressing need to prove yourself to the group. So it kind of stuck for quite a few years.
And this was a way to earn money. Like they were actually engaging in prostitution, escort services.
So depending on the country that you were in. So if escorting was legal, then the women were made to sign up with escort groups. If not, it was going to nice bars or hotel lobbies and meeting affluent men. Father David said too, he wanted them to reach people that were high up in the government or military, traveling businessmen who had a lot of money. And it was so interesting that we were such a closed group. We weren't allowed as kids to read fairy tales or, storybooks, nothing from the outside world. So Father David would plagiarize a lot of stuff. And one of the little comics that he put out for us was called Beauty and the Beast. And he plagiarized the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. And it was supposed to represent our mothers as beauty, and the beast was outside men. And this was a little story to show us why our moms needed to be prostitutes, because they were going to sleep with the beast and turn them into Prince Charmings.
Oh my God, that's so creepy.
Yes, it is. It is. And in the little storybook, beauty is always naked. You can actually go look at xfamily.org and you can actually see these publications that were printed out. But it's easy to judge the first generation and, say, how could they do this? How could they allow this to happen? But one of the reasons that we're talking about this is to really shine a light on how difficult it is once you get into a high control group. Psychologically, to break free is so, so difficult. And you kind of become part of the sickness by being pressured into doing things. It's like if you're in an abusive relationship, but hundreds of people around you are also in the same relationship, all making you stay.
Yeah.
It's just really difficult.
And they were also really isolated. You mentioned that the group moved to another country. Can you give me an idea of how many other countries the group ended up in?
Yeah. So we think at the height or over time, there were 100,000 members that had funneled through. The most ever at one time were 10,000 members. Most of those were children. This was in 80 different countries around the world. And these were all in communes. So we had like walled houses that we would rent, and you were not allowed to invite people over. The only people that I remember ever coming over were Johns. And, neighbors didn't come over. Family could not visit. Our locations were all secret. You did not leave the house without calling in, and you had code phrases and words to use. And if they answered correctly, then that meant it was safe to come back into the house from town. So it was an extremely secretive community. And we were extremely isolated. No television, no magazines, no newspapers, no outside friends or family. Any letters that came to you, either from people in the cult or let's say your parents wrote you a letter, they were opened and read, and they had to be approved before they would give it to you.
Wow.
And the same with outgoing letters as well.
How did your parents get involved in this?
So it was my mom. And she had me and my older brother, and she was very disillusioned with the world. The Vietnam War had just ended, and she was just sick of American capitalism and war and violence. And she met these wonderful, smiley, beautiful hippies that were happy, and they love bombed her, and they hugged her, and they told her they were going to make a better world and that she could come join them and be part of this group. And she told me that it just seemed like such a wonderful way to raise her kids. Her kids were going to be saviors of the world and do great things.
She already had you and your brother.
Yeah.
So did your father join the group too?
No, he did not. And they had a big kind of struggle. She was trying to join, and I was a baby and my brother was a toddler, and my father said, no, the kids have to be with me. And she's like, no, they're coming with me. So the cult actually had members come and help her kidnap us and bring us back to the cult.
Like take you away from your father's house.
Physically take us, yeah. And then my grandparents and my dad did the same thing.
Oh, and took you guys back. Oh my God.
Yeah, so there was a little bit of a physical struggle a few times, and then the cult decided to change our names and send us overseas and hide us. And yeah.
Wow, that's crazy. So where were you at the time? Were you in Huntington Beach and then they moved you out of the country?
No, this was when they started getting bigger. So she was not one of the first members. They had moved away from Huntington Beach, and there was the Texas Soul Clinic, which was a very large commune. And then they had a few other ones in different states. And this was before the Great Exodus, where he sent everybody overseas. So I believe this was in New Orleans. I'm not clear on all the details, I actually just found out my mom's legal name
Oh.
recently. I didn't know her first name. And I actually ordered my birth certificate and saw her name and was texting my brothers, hey, did you know what mom's name was? And we're all
Oh.
laughing. We're like, oh my God, I had no idea.
Wow.
So legal names were not allowed to be used. And then people changed their names all the time. And it was part of our security process as well as a psychological process. Anytime that you were having some rebellious thoughts or you were unyielded, they would break you down psychologically and then they would change your name and say, well, now you're a new person. You're going to be yielded now. You're not that person that had doubts before. And yeah, my brother has like 3 different names that I still to this day will get them mixed up.
And do you mind sharing what yours was when you were in the group?
Actually, I was one of the rare ones that didn't get her name changed very often because I was secretly very naughty, but outwardly I was very compliant. So I was only called Christina and then I was called Tina. And I kept waiting for a name change to happen because all my friends around me were switching names. And if you ran into them in a different commune in a different country, they would literally have a different name. And so you'd have to see their face to know, like, oh, wait, I know you. Oh, yeah, now I'm Bathsheba. I'm not,
Oh, confusing.
I'm not Sarah anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. And adults didn't use their legal names.
So when your mom finally got you back, your mom and the group got you and your brother back from your dad and left the country, where did you guys end up going?
From what I can remember, we went to Jamaica, then Puerto Rico, then Canada, then the
Wow.
US, then Mexico, then Hawaii, then Guam, then Saipan, then Japan, then Korea, then the Philippines.
So when you think of some of your first memories as a kid, I mean, you probably were too young to remember your mom actually joining.
No.
But when you think back to your earliest memories, like what country do you remember being in?
So I remember a little bit from Jamaica, but I think it's because my mom told me the story because I must have been around 4 years old. So I have this memory of the beaches and I remember like coconut trees or banana trees, and we actually lived on Banana Lane. And the Jamaican government actually kicked us out. They raided the commune and they were saying, you're the CIA and you need to leave our country. And I remember like just the guards in the house telling us we had to go. So then after that, we went to Puerto Rico. And I actually have some good memories of Puerto Rico. So this was before the flirty fishing became like a big thing, or at least I don't remember my mom doing it at the time or other women in the cult doing it. Us kids and my dad, we would go out and sing on the streets and beg for money. And we'd pass out these little tracts and ask for donations. And my stepdad, not my biological dad.
Okay.
My mom was actually married again. It was an arranged marriage, but he would buy us these drinks called Malta Indias. And it was kind of like a soda. So one thing about the cult is sugar was absolutely forbidden. White bread was forbidden. Anything white was forbidden. No sugar. You could have molasses, but you couldn't have, no candy and stuff like that. So if we made enough money that day, my stepdad would buy us this Malta India drink and we'd have to drink it really fast before we got home. It was very exciting and very naughty.
So first of all, I'm curious about how your group had the money to expand to so many countries, to move you guys around. It sounds like you said you were out working even as a child. If you could elaborate on that.
Yes, it's a fascinating part, but also, you're going to kind of be like, well, duh. So basically, it's your pyramid scheme, just like every other cult or, Amway, whatever. So there were 2 kinds of ways that we made money. One was us children selling like religious pamphlets or singing on the street, asking for money. Eventually they had tapes and posters that we had to sell. We had to buy these from the cult, and there were certain quotas that you had to buy. And then once you bought them and sold them, then you gave a percentage of the money back to the cult again. And then the other way of raising money was, the prostitution, which didn't last forever. Eventually it was banned when the big AIDS scare happened. And the world was also catching on to that. So one of the things about this cult is they would change, like when public opinion would find out about something, or, newspapers would print an article, they would be like, oh, okay, well, we don't do that anymore. And then they would come up with some other weird thing to do. But they were very polished and very aware of how the media would see us or what was acceptable in society. And they would push the limits all the time. And we were taught a lot of secrecy. But when it could no longer be kept secret, then they would say, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. That's ridiculous. We would never do that anymore. And now we're going to do something different.
Well, while that was going on, I'm curious about what you thought as a child, seeing your mom and other grown-ups engage in this.
Yeah. So growing up, besides being a very dark apocalyptic group, we were put to bed with stories of how we were going to die, martyr stories of families being stripped naked and sent onto the ice and freezing to death. But it's beautiful because they won't deny their faith, and this is going to be you. So we were extremely apocalyptic. The founder was always predicting things. And then the other side was, it was a very sexually charged group. And I don't remember the days when it was a very pure, traditional Christian type of group. I was born after they started the craziness. But like all of the founders' writings were very sexualized. We were being taught and groomed that women were made by God to serve men sexually, and that to say no was a sin. There's no such thing as no. And you actually are the sinner. If you say no and force a man to rape you, it's your fault. So all of those things were like being taught. And so the flirty fishing and stuff to me it was just kind of like, this is what women do. And I saw a lot of unhappiness amongst the adults. I saw husbands crying and women not wanting to go do things, but the leaders forcing them or publicly shaming them. I saw a lot of drama, including my mom. She was one of the people that were very vocal against not doing it. But I remember the shame and the commune meetings where they would publicly shame her and try to force her to do stuff. It was I frankly liked the Johns growing up. They would bring us food. They were always nice to us. It just seemed very normal. And I thought maybe one day, if I didn't die an early death like they had told me, that maybe one day I could also be a prostitute for Jesus.
Oh, no.
It was very glamorized and kind of just taught to us as the ultimate thing that you can do.
Wow.
And frankly, you got to leave the commune if you did. So that was another thing.
So it looked good to a certain extent. Like, from your eyes, it looked like, oh,
yeah,
this is something that we do.
Yeah, in the group, women weren't allowed to fix their hair or wear makeup. They all had to be on a diet and be very thin. But you couldn't wear makeup. You didn't wear perfume. You didn't wear heels. You didn't wear cute little sleek dresses. You were kind of supposed to be barefoot and pregnant and, ready to rumble. So when you watch the women get ready to go out, they would be putting on some perfume and put on a little silk dress and be brushing their hair. And the founder was telling us how this is so wonderful and telling us that his wife was, she brought 7 different men in one night, and how wonderful is that? And then their firstborn son, her firstborn son was what we call Jesus babies. So if a woman got pregnant from outside of the cult, that was called a Jesus baby, and that was seen as a very high honor. But families, like he called our biological parents, our flesh mommy and flesh daddies. And it was considered to be kind of yucky. It's just your flesh family. He started right away, actually, kind of dissolving the traditional family unit.
Yeah.
And before the sexual stuff started, he actually wrote a letter saying, it was titled One Wife. And he went on to say that we're just all one big family, and that individual families and biological families are selfish. And the rabbit hole goes very deep with this. So
Yeah. No, unfortunately, that type of thing isn't unusual. Just in an effort to gain control, leaders will try to break apart whatever families are there, credit the
right.
family.
Yeah, that's the thing to remember is that the goal is always to exploit financially or sexually people under you. So follow the money. Where is the money going?
Mhm.
And who has, the sexual power, I think, is one of the symptoms of these destructive groups. You almost always see that. I've never heard of a cult that didn't have some kind of sexual doctrine,
Mm.
even if it's in the reverse, where you're not allowed to have sex, like Heaven's Gate,
Yeah.
where nobody was allowed to have sex. The control of your sexuality is something that they all seem to have in common, whatever flavor it is.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I would say that the group I was raised in was somewhat sexually repressed in a way. Like,
Yeah,
you weren't allowed to sleep in the same bed like married couples at a certain point or the same room.
right.
Of course, the leader was, having affairs,
Of
but
course.
everyone else had to abide by this.
Yeah,
So, yeah, that is a big control technique.
yeah.
So, I know that at a certain point, children started being brought into the sexuality of the group. Could you tell me a little more about that?
Well, it's kind of like the fable of the frog in the boiling water. The fable goes, which it's not actually true, but it's a good analogy. If you put a frog in boiling water, he's going to hop out. But if you put a frog in just lukewarm water and you slowly turn up the heat, he'll just stay in it and boil. And so that's basically what they did with the sexual doctrines. It started out, like I said, very slow. It was a grooming process for the adults and then for the children eventually. There was no, in the beginning, children's literature. We read what the adults read. Eventually, they came out with kids' stuff, but the whole time was always grooming to be sexually compliant. So it started with just suggestions and new doctrines, and then it went to the prostitution pretty fast, in my opinion. But, by that time, you were already used to them telling you who you could and couldn't sleep with. So it's almost the same thing. Again, they're telling you who you can and can't sleep with,
Mm.
just a different flavor of that. So after all of that was kind of normalized and just part of our group, and couples were being made to quote unquote share. There were sharing schedules. So the leaders in the home would have a schedule where they would pair different adults up with each other because romantic entanglements were considered selfish. So you needed to swap wives. And there was a schedule to make sure that everybody was sharing with everybody equally. So this was all very normal and normalized. And then the founders sent out some more letters, and he started first of all with telling stories of his childhood and how with him sex was, his parents said it was bad and evil and his nanny molested him, but he had sexual fantasies towards his mother and it was normal. And then he started talking about dreams that he had that were sexual towards mothers or children. And then not long after that, then he started suggesting that people do it with their children because children's sexuality needed to be awakened. And who better to do that than loving parents or loving uncles and
Oh,
aunts?
so he was promoting incest.
Yes. Oh, 100%.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, I had heard about the children being involved in the sharing schedule, but
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
know that that extended to, like, your own family.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
horrific.
Yeah. It's not fun to talk about.
No.
And eventually, the good news is, by the time most of us first older kids started turning around 12, we actually started saying that we didn't like it, we didn't want to participate. And the world also started taking notice. Some of the publications were sent to authorities, and a few parents had left and taken their kids with them or tried to get their kids back and brought the authorities in on it. And just word started getting around that they were doing crazy things. And we were also saying, we're not liking this. Doesn't feel right. And they did eventually outlaw that. So that's good.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So you were 12 and already involved in this sharing schedule with
Oh,
adults.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, with me, it started around 10 or 11 is when it kind of started. And
I'm so sorry.
yeah, by the time I was 13 or 14, it was banned.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, kind of I believe, a reaction to us starting to speak our minds and also become more interested in the outside world. They set up camps around the world
For the kids.
for the young people, like the teenagers. I think you had to be 12 and up to
Okay.
be sent. So all these families had, like, between 8 to 14 or 15 kids each. But when a
Wow.
kid became of age, which was around 12, some as early as 11, they would be given by the parents to the cult to be trafficked. And so then you would be trafficked from commune to commune, where adults who were not your parents were your keepers, and you were just sent to work. But like with most young people, they start getting rebellious and wanting things and wanting change. And so they made camps to send us to reindoctrinate us and to suppress our worldly urges and thoughts and rebellious attitudes.
So tell me about your own experience. At what point were you sent to a camp and where was it?
So myself and my older brother, I was 14 and I believe he was 16. We were sent to a camp in the Philippines called the Jumbo. And part of the whole apocalyptic dogma and story was that during the last days before we were all killed, we were going to have superpowers. And the more yielded we were, then the more powers we were going to have. And, so they told us we were being sent to this camp to, first of all, to retrain us and to make us pure, that we were getting ready for the end time and for the tribulation. And so we knew that we were going to training. We knew that it was going to be tough, but it was so much worse than I ever could have imagined. The camp that I was sent to, there were about 200 people that lived there. It was a walled community with high walls with broken glass bottles and barbed wire all around it. We had armed guards inside of the compound, presumably to keep strangers out. But as a teenager, trapped there for a year and a half without access to leaving, it felt to me like they were keeping us in. And it was very intense. It was a lot of calisthenics. Every minute of your time was scheduled. They had public shaming, public beatings where you had to watch other kids. They engaged in humiliating things to break our spirits and our personalities.
That's terrible.
Yes, it was pretty bad. For me, they went too far, and that really was when I realized that not only the outside world was dangerous and not safe, but that these people were not either.
So how did they go too far with you? I mean, it all sounds terrible. What was, in your opinion, at the time going too far?
Yeah, when you're growing up so abused, you do kind of get a little hardened to pain and physical punishment for yourself. But one thing that's really difficult is to watch people you love being tormented and hurt. And they took my brother and they put him in isolation and in confinement. And I couldn't find him for months. I didn't know where he was. And then one day I was doing my duties and I saw him with the other group of what they called detention teens. And this was the super, super bad kids. And it turned out they had him there because they suspected that he might be gay. And he was doing calisthenics, and I saw him keel over and throw up, and they're yelling at him, keep going, keep going. And he was so thin, and I wasn't allowed to go talk to him. He disappeared again for a long time. And then I saw him one day. I was doing my chores and he walked up, and I could barely recognize him. He was so skinny, and he had a mask on his face, and he had a sign around his neck that said, I'm on silence restriction, don't talk to me. And I grabbed him and I hugged him, and I could hear him muttering in my ear, and I was like, what? And he points to his sign, the don't talk to me, because if you got caught talking to one of the detention teens, then you would also be in detention. So I just said, I don't care.
That's horrible. Well, it just makes me wonder, like, at any point, did any of the adults involved say something? I mean, I know they were under a lot of pressure, but I guess with all these people and all these things happening, you would want to think that
Yeah.
someone would be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this to children. And
Yeah. So I didn't see a lot of that. What I did see was the fear in which we lived in. The adults also lived in that fear. The founder taught that young people, including his granddaughter, that we were susceptible to demon possession. So our parents believed that it was the end of times. They believed that we could be demon possessed. I've talked to some adults and they did say, like, oh, it seemed harsh or wrong, but we were worried for your souls. Like they thought they
mm,
were saving our lives, and that, I mean, they truly believed. And, I look back and I go, I don't think I believe the way that they did, but I think the adults really believed. Another thing, too, that helps that kind of abuse work is that the kids were not with their parents. So the parents would not be teaching their kids. Sometimes they wouldn't be in the same commune as their kids. So you're also seeing somebody else's kid. There's a sort of disconnect when it's not your kid. It's just a little easier to take, just that much easier to take when it's not your children, your biological children. So part of separating the kids from their parents, and younger kids were separated from their parents as well. It was just extremely common if you were over 12. But if you were under 12, the kids would all sleep in certain rooms and the adults all slept separate, and us teenagers would take care of the children. And then once a week, they had like a family day. And then they were assigned a teenager to come watch the kids on the family days. So we actually never got days off. And then in the evening, sometimes they would eat dinner with their parents. Sometimes there was like a little bit of family time.
so I'm wondering, what were the first moments you remember of actually thinking, this isn't right, I need to leave?
Yeah, well, the I need to leave really kind of hit home in the Philippines, in the prison camp. Before that time, a lot of us actually had a very common fantasy because we all believed that we were going to be killed and it was the end of the world. But we all had this fantasy. Everybody, all the adults died before us, and we had to go out into the world and survive for a short time on our own. So there was that little fantasy of like, well, maybe that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
In the Philippines was when I was really like, wow, this isn't right. This is wrong. And I kind of had an epiphany that if God was real, then they weren't listening to him because, watching my brother be punished, and I always thought he was the good one. I knew that he believed everything, whereas I kind of had my doubts, and I was kind of always being a little sneaky and naughty. And I was like, if he believes and God's letting him get punished instead of me, then they're not listening to him. Something's not right here. But it still would take me years and years to leave because the thing is, you don't have any connection to the outside world. You don't have friends or family. You have no education. A sixth grade education was the highest that was allowed in the cult. And most of us didn't even get that. Once I learned how to read, I was working full time after that. So all of us older ones were always working. So we had to learn how to read so we could read the founders' writings, but we just worked our entire lives. So that going out into the world, that it's not a friendly place. I'd never seen, like I said, the kindest people in society were the Johns that I saw. And then begging on the street, you see pity in people's eyes. You also see anger. You don't see the best of society standing on the street begging for money.
No, I'm sure you don't.
So just the whole concept of going out into the world was just terrifying. And you grew up with this: together we are strong, together we're going to save the world, but alone you're nothing. You're less than a piece of dirt. So you go out and you realize, like, you don't know anything. You don't know the music, you don't know the culture, you don't know the food, you don't have any of the same experiences. You don't know what a normal family is like.
Yeah. And so also, you mentioned that at a certain point, at a young age, you became a parent yourself.
Yeah. So after the founder died, the cult started trying to go a little more mainstream. They softened up some of the rules. I was sent to California, and we had a fake commune in Hacienda Heights to fool the media. So we would let the media know, like, okay, we're in America now, and here's what a commune looks like. Instead of 50 children, we had 3 children. It was totally fake. And I knew it. I knew that I was there to show the world that we were okay and that everything was good. But I had a hope in my heart that things were going to change. We had always grown up with the doctrine of deceivers yet true, which was, you had to be completely honest to the group, but to outsiders, you could lie. So I was part of that for a while. And it was very interesting when I was on the Today Show with Megyn Kelly. They actually pulled up some footage that I had done while I was in the cult as a teenager. It was an NBC clip, and they were like, "Is this you?" And I was like,
wow.
Yep, I was defending the cult. But yeah, so my ex-husband, he was looking at joining, and he was going through the 6-month intensive training to join the cult. And right when he decided that it wasn't for him, he met me. And so we wanted to be together. And the cult said, you cannot get married. So they really just like doing arranged marriages only. So since we chose each other, and it was a quote unquote love match, it was deemed selfish.
And how old were you at the time?
Well, I was 19. So
okay.
not that young, but now I look back and I go, wow, I was young.
And he's the person who you ended up having children with.
Yeah. So we had 2 kids. And during those 2 years that we had kids, I had one right after the other. He was trying to get me to leave, actually. I was like, yeah, I want to, but like, we cannot survive out there. And he couldn't understand what I was saying. Like, he just did not understand. He's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, no. And I'm like, if we leave, they won't let us come back. And I was just petrified of the outside world. And there was a little hope in my heart that the cult was going to change and that we would become normal. But as the months passed on and my baby started walking and talking, I was just like, I cannot raise my kids in this group. I cannot raise my kids the way that I was raised.
Yeah.
Even if it's better, I still want so much more for them. So he brought me home, and his parents, they said, well, you can stay here. It was on a beautiful plantation home out in the sugarcane fields in Louisiana. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. I was like, okay, I didn't know how we were going to feed ourselves or our kids or anything like that, but there was a place to stay. And so I was like, okay.
So did you just sneak out in the middle of the night?
Well, so like I was telling you before, the cult was around for a long time. There were lots of phases that it went through. So when you were a child or a teenager, anybody under 18, asking to leave was one of the worst things you could do. If you were an adult, if you were over 18 and you wanted to leave, they would let you leave. They just wouldn't let you come back.
Okay. So you were just like, we're out.
Yeah, we just kind of wandered out. They let us go. I wasn't scared of the cult keeping me in. I was scared of how would we survive. I didn't know how to have a conversation with anybody. I hadn't watched any Disney movies. I hadn't, I hadn't ever gone to school. I didn't know how to have a conversation. And some of the first things I did was start going to Sunday school with my kids because I knew Bible stories. And so I tried to fit into the world that way, but that didn't work that well because, you kind of have to lie about everything if you don't tell people your past. When they're like, oh, remember we used to ride bikes down the road and we used to get ice cream from the ice cream truck? You're like, no. Oh, remember this song we used to listen to in high school? No. Oh, remember when we were allowed to bake cookies with our grandma? And no, what's a grandma?
Wow.
There's some of the basic things about the human experience was so foreign to me.
Yeah, I'm really curious about how you interacted with other people. I mean, you were a parent, so you must have interacted with other parents. That must have been a really tough transition.
Yeah, well, I grew up lying to outsiders, so I kind of just kept that going. I would just not talk about myself very much. I would say, oh, my parents were missionaries and I lived overseas a little bit. And I found people very uninterested. And then instead of me answering their questions about, oh, remember this or remember that, I just would ask people questions. And I would just keep asking them questions about themselves. What do people love to do? Talk about themselves. So it worked really good, but I really struggled making any real friends because I didn't know what I liked or didn't like. I didn't know what kind of music I liked or didn't like. So all of my relationships were very shallow, and I really didn't feel like what we called systemites were outsiders for many, many years. It really wasn't until I came out and was like, this is who I am. This is where I came from.
And how were your children? Like, how did your children adjust? I mean, they must have been pretty young when you left, but did they have a tough time adjusting as well?
No, they didn't really. I think they had a harder time probably with a lot of the things that I carried out with me, a lot of distrust of people. I homeschooled them. I was just very scared to let them go for sleepovers, or I always taught them to work because I just thought children had to work. So I was always like, oh, kids, you got to work. Okay, here, you got to do this chore. You got to work with the family business. And we talk about it now and we laugh and we talk about, the good and the bad. And there were a lot of things that I didn't realize that I was carrying out of the church that they've now had to deal with. And luckily, they always felt like I loved them. And I did make sure to let them do lots of things that I never got to do. I just was definitely one of those hovering parents. I was like, sure, you can go, but I'm coming with you. They were allowed to read any book they ever wanted to read. I would never say no, no matter what book it was. And every now and then it would be a book that I was like, oh, this is not appropriate. So then the rule changed and it was like, okay, if it's an adult book, then I have to read it with you.
Yeah.
But, we weren't allowed to read books growing up. So I kind of lived vicariously through them. And I believe I had a lot of corrective experiences, just experiencing life with my kids and getting to do all of my first with them, like bake chocolate chip cookies with them or read books and watch Arthur on TV and reading Rainbow and all the Disney movies. Wow. All of that was just a first for me.
So what happened with your education? Did you end up going back to school?
No, I'm self-educated. So I had 4 kids and I was a homeschool mom and I had a family business. So I really didn't have time to go back to school. I read a lot. I study a lot. There's other survivors who have. I just never personally did. So I'm self-educated. I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah. So tell me about who you are now. Like, how are you doing? What's your life like?
I'm a full-time artist now. My kids are all grown. They're all young adults and we're very close. I have a professional mural business and I also do fine art. And I do acrylic on canvas and I love it. Art was not something that I ever got to express or do. The few times that I got caught drawing, my art was ripped up and thrown away. So I always had that in me. I was always, drawing in the sand or finding a pen and sketching or a pencil. And I would always get in trouble for it growing up. So once I was free, I started playing with art. And the first thing that I did, I didn't have any art supplies, but I had found this little palette of bright colored eyeshadows. And I started taking that and rubbing it onto paper and like making art. And
yeah, you got to work with what you have.
Started making these like sunsets with makeup. Yeah. And then somebody gave me some watercolors and I started playing with watercolors and I just never stopped doing art. I just kept going.
Right.
And now I'm very good, but I wasn't good at first. So it's taken a long time, but it was one of those things that they couldn't ever suppress that in me. It's always been there.
So what ended up happening with your parents? Are you still in touch with them? Is your mom still in the group?
No, my mom actually left around the same time as me. She actually went and finished her college education and she has what we call system job. And she, like many of the first generation, are not able to talk about what happened. I believe there's a lot of guilt and shame Many of people in that generation don't believe in therapy. They're all in very deep hiding and do not want to come out. And it's made it really hard to educate people and to have their side of the story told. And I find there's a lot of anger towards the first generation. And I'm kind of rooting for a path to redemption for them. They also were victims, obviously not as bad as us, but, you know, it was a different flavor of how they were victimized and tricked. So she's still on that journey. And we speak every now and then, and I love her. And I hope one day she can, along with many of the other adults, kind of face the realities. But if not, that's okay too, because I'm speaking for the ones of us who can't speak. Also, I'm not the only one anymore. So I've been speaking on national TV and local TVs and lots of podcasts and magazines, but many of us are writing books. We have a bunch of documentaries. I was in a documentary, Investigation Discovery. Children of the Cult just came out, which is Discovery Plus, and that was a wonderful documentary. They did a really good job. Oh gosh, there's more. There's another documentary. It's Cults and Extreme Beliefs.
Yes, that's a good one.
That my friend Amy did. So there's a lot of information out there on this cult. I always tell people it's okay if you hear this story and it makes you uncomfortable. If it makes you sad, that's okay. Just don't turn away. We need to talk about this. It's reality. It's what happened. There were thousands of us who grew up this way around the world. The US government didn't and doesn't know what to do about it. We're told that the statute of limitations is up. We're told that because the crimes were committed overseas, that they don't have jurisdiction. But this stuff is real and it's not going to end. You know, you're always going to have people in positions of power trying to take advantage of other people.
Yeah.
I hope and pray that it never gets this big again. But we're seeing charismatic leaders pop up even today. I'm hoping that the more information we get out there, the less it's going to happen and the more awareness there is for people. I want there to be less stigma for people who are in high control groups or relationships. When you get out, the stigma needs to go away. Like, we need to be able to talk about it. We need to be able to learn to move on. But just stuffing it and keeping secrets is not the answer.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's so important that people like you are coming forward and talking about this. I know that in the past you didn't really know what to do with it or how people were going to react to the story.
Well, I tried saying stuff to people. I was always told, don't talk about it. Don't tell anybody. And really, you know, it wasn't until Me Too that I felt comfortable actually coming out and talking about it, which is shocking. You know, now I look back and I'm like, oh my God, I tried asking for help. I tried telling people, and people would tell me, people who were close to me, don't talk about that. Don't say that. Don't tell anybody. People are going to look down on you. People are going to think you're uneducated, that you're damaged. So the Me Too movement kind of kicked it off for me. So I'm a fan. Yay.
Well, that's so great to hear. So you didn't talk about it very much until Me Too happened.
Yeah.
So what did you end up doing? Like, did you just do the Me Too thing and then like write your story, you know, on a Facebook post?
Yeah, it's pretty funny. So I did a Me Too post, and then I saw an article where these two fellow survivors from the Children of God were coming out. And I read the article and I was really proud of them. And I was like, wow, good for them. They're coming out publicly. And then I realized, like, oh, my kids are like in high school and middle school, and they're going to find out. Like, they're going to put the pieces together because they knew enough of the past. It took me years to get rid of all the cult material that was in the house and that was taken with us. You had to carry all the cult material with you wherever you went. And there was stuff in the attic. I was like, they're going to remember something and they're going to find out. So I came out to a couple close friends and they were super supportive and they believed me, first of all. And I was like, well, I'm not showing you any proof yet. I have proof, but I'm not showing it to you. And you believe me? And they're like, yes. And I was like, oh my God, wow. So then I decided it was time to tell my kids. I sat them all down in the living room and I told them. It was a very vanilla version. I didn't get into details, but I did let them know that I grew up in a cult and that the older two were born in it and that it was very bad. It was a very dark experience and I was happy to be out. And they kind of sat there for a minute. And then one of them said, well, we're glad you told us, but now we know why you're so weird. This makes sense. And they all kind of laughed and were like, yeah. And I laughed too. It was a good moment. And over the years, they've asked me more questions. They've learned a lot more about it, but it's been a slow gathering of information. I definitely didn't pour it on them. So after that, I decided, well, I'm going to write a book. And I was kind of just thinking like a book for my kids and for my close friends and family. I was like, this story needs to be told. It's crazy. And so I did a GoFundMe on my Facebook page, and I thought only my friends and family were going to see it, but I've got some challenges with computers and the internet. I just didn't realize it was going to go everywhere once I posted it. So Marie Claire magazine in the UK contacted me, and I was like, how did you know about me? And they were like, well, we saw your GoFundMe. And I was like, what? You're on my Facebook? And they're like, no, it's on GoFundMe. And I was like, oh no. So I was like, okay, well, sure, I'll talk to you because it's over in Europe. Nobody's going to see it. Well, again, this internet thing, it was published in Europe, but it was all over the internet in the US. So then the Megyn Kelly show contacted me, and I was like, again, I thought it was a prank. I was like, what? Really? So I did a few other things, Dr. Oz and documentary and some other things, but I decided to stick with doing podcasts because legacy media, they only have a few minutes to get the story out. And so it tends to be more dramatic, and it's a really complex group. The length that this went on for, it's more than just, here's a sad little kid that was hurt. There's a lot of information that needs to get out, not just, I'm not here to get attention. Mm-hmm. And so podcast seems to be like the best way. The second is documentaries. So I'm happy that you're letting me speak and that we're together educating.
Yeah, no, I definitely am very glad that you see this as a good way to get your story out there. I definitely have to wonder. I've heard some horror stories from people when they first came out with their story, and, especially people who have been on some of the talk shows that were out there. They complained about their experience. So I always wonder when people go public, how is that going to go for you? I hope it's okay.
Yeah, well, it's not always okay. And it's really funny because I see coming out and speaking publicly as like a community service. It's a sacrifice for me. I don't benefit financially, but I get accused of wanting attention, or the cult has even sent out a couple rebuttals accusing me of trying to make money. I can't imagine anybody doing it for fun.
Yeah,
like it's
totally.
It's not fun. I feel a responsibility to speak for, my siblings and for all the other survivors who are either too scared to speak out or cannot speak out. So I've done enough therapy and I have the support of my kids. And so I can do it.
That's great.
But yeah, media is not always kind. But you know what? I can complain about the media as well. But you know what? The media has helped our cause more than the FBI has, more than social services did, or the agencies that, you think would.
Yeah, well, that's why the media is so important. I come from a biased position on this. I like news stories. I like knowing what's going on and everything. But then also at the same time, since I've been working in this space, talking to cult survivors, studying these kind of groups of control, I also want them to be okay. And it's been interesting walking this fine line of wanting people to use the media in a way that can educate the public and help them, but then also people can get exploited. So you don't want that either.
Yeah. And this needs to be a conversation. My goal is not to stop groups from forming. There are probably some really good groups out there that create a commune and it works out great and wonderful. But it's really, we're talking about high control groups. We're talking about tactics that they use to do thought reform. There are so many ways in which humans who want to exploit other humans will use these tactics. It's kind of like having the tools in your tool belt to see through bullshit.
Yeah.
And my story is extreme. The Children of God is an insane group. And But, we looked really polished from the outside. So if you looked at us on the outside, you wouldn't really know what questions to ask. You wouldn't know what to look for. And it was so glamorous. And we always looked so pretty and happy and smiley that it would have been easy to be tricked. And I think there are a lot of groups like that. There's a lot of charismatic people in the world, and we don't need to all be afraid, but we do need to know, okay, this is a red flag. If nobody calls them on their bullshit, they're going to keep going. So the media is a great source of putting that information out there and saying, look, here's these people's stories. Here's what happens. Here's when it's taken too far.
Yeah.
Here's a red flag. So, yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful that you are one of the people who are talking about this stuff and showing us the red flags and being honest. So thank you so much for coming on my show and for telling your story. I know that it can't be easy.
Nope, it's not. It's cathartic. I don't have to keep these secrets anymore. I'm not participating. I'm not keeping the secrets, and that's a burden off of my shoulders. And I know that I'm doing the right thing by speaking out. So, and I don't really care what anybody thinks anymore. So, yay.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Deanna Levy, with original music by Leanne Dunn and opening and closing music by The Cha. If you like the show, please check out our Patreon page. You can support it for as little as $2 a month. Next time, we'll be speaking with another person who grew up in the Children of God.